Greetings and welcome to another edition of Resistance Rising with Johnny Cirucci. I am your host, Johnny Cirucci, on the program that brings you news and commentary that will set you free. Information you just will not get anywhere else. And I'm your host, Johnny Cirucci, and I am currently reading from my first book, Illuminati Unmasked, originally published back in 2015. We're talking about the Jesuit influences that helped create both communism and Nazism. We've made it up to page 97. In his book, Hitler Speaks, reformed Nazi Hermann Rauschning stated that Hitler drew his inspiration for order and regime from both the Jesuits and the Vatican. Citing Rauschning, "I have learned especially from the Jesuit order. Moreover, as far as I remember, Lenin did the same. There has never been anything more grandiose on the earth than the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church. Directly, I carried much of this organization into my own party. You took the Church's hierarchical organization and Freemasonry, designing an order with his vow of obedience, discretion, and with its esoteric doctrine that manifests itself in the gradual initiation. But what have you taken in the protocols of the Elder of Zion?" I asked. Back to the text. The Jesuits would have much to do with the protocols of Zion as well. This was a mutually aggrandizing arrangement, and the Nazi Party was empowered on the back of the Catholic Church. Next is a citation from Pope Benedict, a biography. Hitler came to power on the back of the Catholic Church. Catholic leaders never supported the Weimar experiment with democracy, which they saw as a legacy of the Enlightenment and the Kulturkampf. Pause. The so-called Enlightenment was also a construct of the Catholic Church to bolster its pseudoscience and further attack true Protestant evangelical Christianity. Back to the citation. The Enabling Act, which was the legal instrument giving Hitler the power to rule by decree, passed by the Reichstag on March 24, 1933, was able to squeak through only after it was endorsed by Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, the leader of the Center Party. Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, the leader of the Center Party. Kaas acted in coordination with the German bishops. 4 days later, on March 28th, the German bishops rescinded their ban on Nazi Party membership. On April 1st, Cardinal Adolf Bertram of Breslau addressed German Catholics in a letter, warning them, quote, to reject, as a matter of principle, all illegal or subversive activities, end quote. Back to the text. In a series of policies enacted between 1871 to 1878, known as Kulturkampf, the cultural struggle, Otto von Bismarck expelled the Jesuits from Prussia and Germany and did all he could to mitigate interference in German affairs by the Vatican. Next, a citation from Hitler's Pope by John Cornwell. Pause there. Eugenio Pacelli was not Hitler's Pope. That is a Vatican psychological operation. As you've been hearing, Adolf Hitler was a pawn and puppet of the Vatican, and Freemason Eugenio Pacelli, also known as Pius XII, helped put him in place. Onto this citation. In Germany, partly in response to the divisive dogma of Vatican I's papal infallibility, Bismarck began his Kulturkampf, the cultural struggle, a policy of persecution against Catholicism. Religious instruction came under state control, and religious orders were forbidden to teach. The Jesuits were banished, seminaries were subjected to state interference, church property came under the control of lay committees, civil marriage was introduced in Prussia, bishops and clergy resisting Kulturkampf legislation were fined, imprisoned, and exiled. Pause. Now, this is the persecution of Catholicism.
Quotes, unquotes, and quotes.
But of course, Horner neglects to tell you about the centuries of murder and deceit and overthrow of governments that led up to this anger and rebellion and distrust of all things Catholic, especially all things Jesuit. And this is the same theme that comes about often almost always in regards to so-called historians or journalists that cover this on the very rare occasions that a people or a government should strike back. It's always painted in terms of, the poor Catholic Church and this undeserved persecution. Back to the text, these slights put Germany in the crosshairs of the most dangerous people on earth, the Jesuits. The Third Reich was cunningly created by the company and then aimed at one of Rome's most hated enemies, the Jews. Their chastisement was prolonged by papal puppets like 33rd degree Freemason Franklin Roosevelt, who returned fleeing Jewish refugees back to Europe and kept rail lines sending Jews to their deaths free from bombardment. All of that has citations, by the way. As with any movement, it required the will of the people to function, because fascism masked its totalitarian designs by appealing to nationalist identity amongst the citizenry. It has been purposefully mislabeled as, quote, right-wing, end quote, ideology. This couldn't be further from the truth. The key word in defining what Nazism was and is socialism. I next quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica: National Socialism, German National Socialismus, also called Nazism or Nazism, totalitarian movement led by Hitler as head of the Nazi Party in Germany. In its intense nationalism, mass appeal, and dictatorial rule, National Socialism shared many elements with Italian fascism. Back to the text, it was as convenient as it was powerful in the hands of the Holy See. And next I cite A Woman Rides the Beast by Dave Hunt. Remember that Hitler and Mussolini remained Catholics to the end and were never excommunicated from the Church. So did thousands of the worst Nazi war criminals whom the Vatican smuggled out of Europe into safe havens in South America. Such arch-criminals are honored with Catholic funerals and, like mafia members, die with the assurance that their church will continue to say masses in order to get them out of purgatory and eventually into heaven. Back to the text, the foundational component of fascism is the co-opting of major industries, manufacturing, banking, and private wealth. But fascism is profoundly Luciferian and shares all the same agenda of the original humanistic rebellion from Babylon through communism to the death and rebirth of the Muslim Caliphate, all manipulated by superclass families, Rome, and ultimately Satan. I have a footnote on superclass. Superclass is a term coined by former Kissinger associate, managing director David Rothkopf, in his 2008 book of the same name to describe the 6,000 some odd individuals who have wealth to immediately affect the political process of nation states. And of course, Rothkopf gets published because he's Jewish. I next cite from another Jew, Jonah Goldberg, a conservative Jew, and therefore may fall into the category of controlled opposition. Only Jonah knows what he knows and what he keeps to himself to protect himself and harm us. But Liberal Fascism is a good book. It's a worthy read. In place of Christianity, fascism offered a new religion of the divinized state and the nation as an organic community. It is simply a fact that in the 1920s, fascism and fascistic ideas were very popular among the American left. Roosevelt's defenders openly admitted their admiration of fascism. Rexford Guy Tugwell, an influential member of Roosevelt's Brain Trust, said of Italian fascism, "It's the cleanest, neatest, most efficient operating piece of social machinery I've ever seen. It makes me envious. We are trying out the economics of fascism without having suffered all its social or political ravages," proclaimed New Republic's editor George Soule, an enthusiastic supporter of the Roosevelt administration. Fascism, like progressivism and communism, is expansionist because it sees no natural boundary to its ambitions. For violent variants like so-called Islamofascism, this is transparently obvious, but progressivism to envision also the New World Order. Back to the text. When people rise up and defeat the pseudo-right of fascism, the elite rise up on the left. Former United Kingdom Minister of Parliament and cabinet member Charles Higham was shocked by the depth of collusion from Western moneyed interests to create the Nazi threat and subsequently fuel the post-war rise of communism. He wrote in his book, Trading with the Enemy, a presidential edict issued 6 days after December 7, 1941, actually set up the legislation whereby licensing arrangements for trading with the enemy could officially be granted. Often during the years after Pearl Harbor, the government permitted such trading. As for Roosevelt, the Sphinx still keeps his secrets. That supreme politician held all the forces of collusion and betrayal in balance, publicly praising those executives whom he knew to be questionable. Before Pearl Harbor, he allowed such egregious executives as James D'Amoni of General Motors and William Rhodes Davis of the Davis Oil Company to enjoy pleasant tete-a-tetes with Hitler and Goering while maintaining a careful record of what they were doing. During the war, J. Edgar Hoover, Adolph A. Burl, Henry Morgenthau, and Harold Ikes kept the president fully advised of all internal and external transgressions. Why did even the loyal figures of the American government allow these transactions to continue after Pearl Harbor? Back to the text. Minister Higham was as perplexed in 1983 as Americans are today. How can such poisonous policies promoted by puppets and politicians not be proscribed and prosecuted by patriots? That's because they're promulgated by the papacy. Subheading: Interlocked. One of the men who funded both the Nazi and Soviet threats to the West was Henry Ford. Next, I cite Anthony C. Sutton. A post-war congressional subcommittee investigating American support for the Nazi military effort described the manner in which the Nazis succeeded in obtaining U.S. technical and financial assistance as quite fantastic. At the outbreak of the war, Ford Werk placed itself at the disposal of the Wehrmacht for armament production. Back to the text. Ford Werk's American holders were a lifeline that kept the industrial legs of the cooperative effort alive. It was working so well, Ford extended help to Germany's old ally, Soviet Russia. Back to Sutton. A U.S. Air Force bombing intelligence report written in 1943 noted that principal wartime activities of the Ford plant are probably manufacture of light trucks and spare parts for all the Ford trucks and cars in service at Axis Europe, including captured Russian Molotovs. Sutton continues, the Russian Molotovs were of course manufactured by the Ford-built works at Gorky in Russia. In France during the war, passenger automobile production was entirely replaced by military vehicles, and for this purpose, 3 large additional buildings were added to the Poissy factory. The main building contained about 500 machine tools, all imported from the United States and including a fair sprinkling of the more complex types such as Gleason gear cutters, Bullard automatics, and Ingersoll borers. Back to the text. Investigations into criminal activities of high treason were made impossible, as America's law enforcement bodies were equally co-opted, as were her political ones. Subheading: Ratlines. At the conclusion of World War II, Nazi leaders were given safe passage to South America by the power of the Vatican. I next cite the Daily Telegraph. Germany is fighting to keep sealed the Adolf Eichmann files detailing the years of Holocaust chief logistic organizer spent on the run before he was captured by Mossad agents. Those hoping to have a 50-year secrecy order overturned believe the government is embarrassed by details within that may prove German and Vatican officials colluded in his escape and freedom. Pause. In no way does the German government share responsibility for this. This was 100% a Vatican operation used by Nazis through the power of the traitors in American government. Back to this spin of this citation. Indeed, the Church's practice of protecting its own perpetrators of various crimes has already been well established, with the tragic revelations of thousands of victims of child sex abuse by cleric pedophiles. For the current papacy under the German Pope Benedict XVI, the 4,500-page Eichmann dossier could be the smoking gun that would shoot down his plans to canonize Pope Pius XII, also known as Hitler's Pope. Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, was himself a member of the Nazi youth. This is usually spun to focus on how the Ratzinger family suffered while resisting the Nazis. Upon his ascension to Holy See, Cardinal Ratzinger's Nazi past did cause some discomfort. Not surprisingly, leftist Jews were still eager to recognize him in the best interest of interfaith dialogue. In fact, former Israeli President Shimon Peres recently beseeched the current Jesuit Pope, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, to create an ecumenical United Nations of religions under his authority. Skeptics are concerned that Peres was put up to the idea by papal insiders for cover. And as a quick aside, journalist, author, and investigator Barry Shamish, also a Jewish Israeli, uncovered how Shimon Peres was Jesuit trained in Poland and born under a completely different name, Simon Persky. Subheading: From Rome to Rio. Horst Wagner was a Nazi that had the blood of at least 350,000 Jews on his hands. In her book, Beloved Criminal, Giselle Heidenreich writes of the monster who at one time wooed her mother. After escaping from a Nuremberg jail in 1948, he later explained to Heidenreich's mother how he was aided on his way to South America on the so-called Kloster line, being given sanctuary in a number of convents and holy orders in Austria before heading to Rome. There, the German Bishop Alois Hudal, priest-confessor to the German Catholic community in the city, arranged for him to get a Red Cross passport in 1951. Hudal also arranged the paperwork for Franz Stengel, the commandant of the extermination camps of Sobibor and Treblinka, to flee to Brazil on a Red Cross passport using Vatican funds. Wagner settled in Bariloche, 1,000 miles south of Buenos Aires, on the edge of Patagonia, and celebrated weekly in Bavarian-style houses with the old SS comrades, drinking beer and singing the marching songs of the lost regime. Back to the text. Pius XII had been ruefully nicknamed Hitler's Pope, and it does little to heal old wounds when Catholic leaders continually petition for him to be canonized. Even recently, Pope Francis has stated that he's considering it. Further proof of war being used to punish the enemies of Rome resides in a 1999 lawsuit. Nazi war criminals helped ease the way for their expatriation with gold they stole from their victims. Surviving members of the forgotten Holocaust in Croatia attempted to get justice from the Catholic Church. Next, I cite from Concordant Watch. The hidden Holocaust, which, though well known to scholars, is rarely mentioned elsewhere, presumably because of the active involvement of the Catholic Church, which used the terror to win an estimated 200 to 300,000 new converts. The current lawsuit is on behalf of three groups of victims in the Croatian Holocaust: the Serbs, who were obliged to wear blue armbands marked with a P for Orthodox, the Jews, who had to wear the Star of David, and the Roma, whose extermination by the Nazis is called the Poramos. No serious historian disputes the claimant's accounts of the origin of the victim gold. And there's a citation: Serbians, Jews, and the Roma were slaughtered in their villages after unspeakable tortures, or burned alive in their churches. Those that were not murdered were expelled to Serbia proper after being despoiled of all their property or forcibly converted to the Roman Catholic faith by Franciscan and Roman Catholic clergy. Many were used as slave laborers. The remaining people were taken to concentration camps, where the majority perished. Back to the text. A United States federal appeals court has dismissed the case, claiming that the Vatican's bank is immune from such prosecution. Rome does indeed have a long arm. Subheading: Free Reign. In 1933, Prescott Bush coordinated with several large Wall Street firms and attempted a military coup against the leftist Freemason Franklin Roosevelt. It was lose-lose for America. Fascists if they win, communists if they lose. Unfortunately for the conspirators, they chose the wrong man for the job. Major General Smedley D. Butler was the only Marine Corps officer to be awarded not one but 2 Congressional Medals of Honor. He had seen more than his fair share of bloodshed in the Banana Wars, where Wall Street fruit interests used Marines to strong-arm themselves massive profits in Central and South America. Butler wrote a blistering indictment of the profiteering, which he delivered as a speech and later a 51-page pamphlet published by Round Table Press titled appropriately War is a Racket in 1935. His sentiments then easily read as if spoken by veterans today, broken and disenfranchised by the never-ending so-called war on terror, but only if you multiply Butler's figures by several times. Next, a citation from War is a Racket. The normal profits of a business concern in the United States are 6, 8, 10, and sometimes 12%, but wartime profits, that is another matter. 20, 60, 100, 300, and even 800%. The sky is the limit. Take our friends, the DuPonts, the powder people. They were a patriotic corporation. Let's look at their average yearly profit during the war years, 1914 to 1918. $58 million a year profit, we find. An increase in profits of more than 950%. Remember, this is $1935. How many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? But Major General Butler refused to be the front man for the coup against Roosevelt, and in 1933 he turned informant on Prescott Bush and co-conspirators like Ambassador to the Soviet Union Averell Harriman, Skull and Bones class of 1913, whose guarantee trust made profits off of both the Nazis and the Communists. No action was taken. I'm going to pause here because we are getting close to the commercial break on First Amendment Radio. And I'm going to say that I probably should have written more cynically about Smedley Butler. How does someone rise to become a major general and get awarded 2 Congressional Medals of Honor? Well, you probably noticed in none of General Butler's diatribes are the words Catholic, Vatican, or Jesuit being heard.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
Greetings and welcome back to Resistance Rising with Johnny Cirucci. I'm your host, Johnny Cirucci, where I am currently reading through my first book, Illuminati Unmasked. And we're going to pick back up on page 104. Subheading, Dull S, a knife in the back. Playing the game of shuffling dictators in South America for wealthy interests was really Rome's forte. By the way, I had just mentioned how I gave probably a little too glowing an account of Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler and his attack on the DuPont family and their war profiteering. William Donovan, whom I never call lovingly Wild Bill, devout Roman Catholic and Knight of Malta, founder of the most poisonous, treasonous organization in the United States, the OSS, which would become the CIA, was a DuPont lawyer. Another thing General Butler never mentioned. Back to the text, Everett Howard Hunt Jr. was the CIA's key agent for a host of important assignments in the 60s, from assassinating a sitting president to framing another president in the Watergate burglary. He also had a hand in overthrowing the government of Guatemala in 1954. Then President Jacobo Arbenz had opened elections to all parties and had even gone so far as to take back some of the land stolen by wealthy international interests. At that time, 3% of Guatemalan landowners held 70% of the land, so Arbenz nationalized over 1.5 million acres, including land belonging to his own family, and redistributed to the peons, the peasants, and the campesinos, the farmers. The problem for President Arbenz was that much of that land belonged to the United Fruit Company, who quickly called in some favors from the Dulles brothers. Everything you need to know about Dwight Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, or his director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, can be found in John Dulles' son, Allen's nephew, Avery Dulles. Avery was a Jesuit priest and a Lawrence J. McGinley Professor of Religion and Society at Fordham University. He would eventually become a cardinal in a move even the press was shocked by. The New York Times stated, when Pope John Paul II designated dozens of new cardinals in early 2001, there were 3 from the United States. Archbishops Edward M. Egan of New York, Theodore McCarrick of Washington were unsurprising choices. Pause. 2 arch criminals, these archbishops. Rome takes particular pleasure in emplacing the worst pedophile protectors in the nation's capital. 5 years later, we've now been informed of some of Theodore McCarrick's heinous crimes in protecting pedophile clergy. And of course, you don't rise to become the Archbishop of New York unless you're equally evil. Back to the New York Times, which is a favorite outlet of propaganda for the CIA. It is common for heads of archdioceses to be given red hats, but the selection of Father Dulles was extraordinary. Pause. Note how the Jew-dominated New York Times is always careful to give due deference to Catholic clergy, calling priests fathers. Back to the citation. Although his was an influential voice in American Catholicism, he was not even a bishop, let alone an archbishop. The appointment was widely seen as a reward for his loyalty to the Pope, but also an acknowledgement of his work in keeping lines of communication open between the Vatican and Catholic dissenters in America. Back to the text. Avery Dulles had lines of communication that were critical to Rome. The Dulles brothers were powerful friends for anyone on Wall Street to have, and it spelled the end of the Arbenz administration in 1954. As E. Howard Hunt explained, the real authority behind regime change was the Catholic Church. I then cite the video documentary, A Coup Made in America.
At CIA headquarters in the summer of 1953, Alan Dulles, the agency's director, recruits E. Howard Hunt as his propaganda chief in the plot to oust Arbenz.
And they took me into a small room in the agency and swore me a special oath. I must never tell what they were going to tell me.
The Americans' strongest ally inside Guatemala is the Catholic Church. The CIA contacts Cardinal Spellman in New York to take part in their psychological war against Arbenz. The Cardinal uses his authority to enlist the full cooperation of the head of the Guatemalan Church, Archbishop Arellano.
Cardinal Spellman convinced his counterpart in Guatemala to issue a pastoral letter several months before the coup, in which the Cardinal basically spelled out his message to the flock that they should rise up against the communists in Guatemala and overthrow them. And then the CIA took that pastoral letter and airlifted it around Guatemala.
We had gotten the okay from Cardinal Spellman to go ahead with this, and I wouldn't presume to trace the lines of authority within the Catholic Church, how they get their information, but they do. And we've always said, you know, in an admiring way, that the Jesuits form the greatest intelligence service in the world, always have.
As usual, the reason why this documentary even aired is because it got the criminal elements in reverse, giving Rome plausible deniability as the puppets or pawns of the CIA. Back to the text. Certainly, if one were interested in intelligence, there would be no better organization behind the enterprise than the Vatican. Citing again from Dave Hunt's A Woman Rides the Beast, the Vatican's constituency of 980 million followers is at least 3 times the number of citizens in any Western democracy, and is exceeded only by the population of China. Even more important than these 980 million people are scattered throughout the world, many of them holding high political, military, and commercial positions in non-Catholic countries. Moreover, the Pope has thousands of secret agents worldwide. They include Jesuits, the Knights of Columbus, Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, and others. The Vatican's intelligence service and its field resources are second to none. Pause. Again, Dave is off here. The numbers of Catholics I've seen anywhere between 1.2 and 2 billion. And the Jesuits aren't a member of Vatican agents. The Jesuits run the show. Back to the text. Francis Cardinal Spellman had been carefully situated to oversee the United States strategies of World War II. Citing from The Neo-Catholics by Betty Claremont, New York's Cardinal Francis Spellman, the most powerful cleric in U.S. history, maintained control of the United States Catholic war effort during World War II. He was named head of the U.S. military chaplains and was deeply involved in post-war measures against the Soviets. Spellman was also instrumental in selection of South Vietnamese president and devout Catholic Ngo Dien Diem. Let me say that again. The Protestant or secular United States government made Francis Cardinal Spellman head of all chaplains in the military. Back to the text. Spellman would later be responsible for America's premier dead end, self-imposed bloodletting, the Vietnam War. Subheading: Cardinal Spellman's War. If ever there was proof of a malignant entity running and ruining America from afar, it is Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a veritable meat grinder that destroyed the finances and lives of both middle-class America and all but the Catholic elite of Vietnam. I next cite the Vietnam War, livinghistoryfarm.org. The Defense Department reported that overall costs of the Vietnam War was $173 billion, equivalent to $770 billion in 2003 dollars. Veterans benefits and interest would add another $250 billion, $1 trillion in 2003 dollars. But the real cost of the war was its impact on the economy, including agriculture. After that, I cite Wikipedia. Total number of deaths in the Vietnam War. Estimates of the number of casualties vary, with the Vietnamese government suggesting as many as 3.1 million violent war deaths, Vietnamese and foreigner soldiers included. A detailed demographic study calculated 791,000 to 1,141,000 war-related Vietnamese deaths, both soldiers and civilians, for all of Vietnam from 1965 to 1975. The study came up with the most likely Vietnamese death toll of 882,000, which included 655,000 adult males above 15 years of age, 143,000 adult females, and 84,000 children. Sidebar: Francis Cardinal Spellman. The office of cardinal was created by the Vatican based upon senior priests who voted on who would be the next pope, cardo being Latin for principal axis. But Rome wanted to emphasize the temporal or earthly authority of such a caste and presented them as a European would present a member of the knighthood, such as Alfred Lord Tennyson, Edward Cardinal Egan. This practice was de-emphasized after Vatican II, but the tradition still exists when the point needs to be made. Back to the text. For Rome, punishing heretic Vietnamese and Protestant Americans for almost 20 years was a masterstroke, and the man who wielded that stroke for the Holy See was Francis Cardinal Spellman. Again, I cite the New York Times. Francis Cardinal Spellman, who was Archbishop of New York from 1939 until his death in 1967, was a major figure in American political life and the history of the Roman Catholic Church. In both the political and ecclesiastical arenas, he sought power avidly and used it aggressively. He was the confidant, advisor, and sometime agent of presidents from Franklin Roosevelt to Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he was influential in New York politics. As the Catholic military vicar to the American Armed Forces, a post separate from but complementary to his position as Archbishop, he supervised chaplains around the world and was a familiar visitor to the battlefields during World War II and the wars in Korea and Vietnam. Back to the text. Media analyst and author Avro Manhattan, 1914 to 1990, was a staunch critic of papal manipulation in world affairs. Manhattan disclosed the shocking evidence that Rome used assassination and clandestine agents to facilitate the Vietnam War in an agenda to embroil Orthodox Russia and Protestant America in a Rome revenge scheme. Although Manhattan believed that the Vatican and her emissaries truly wanted to stamp out communism, this is proven to be completely false, as the war policy guaranteed no clear victory, only ongoing bloodshed. A pause, and as an aside, you always gotta wonder about Manhattan. As a matter of fact, he was a Knight of Malta. Back to the text. Why would the Holy See want to vanquish the most successful method of population control and enslavement, communism, it had created? Next, I cite from Manhattan. In 1947, the Cold War began. Hatred against communist Russia was promoted, headed by the Vatican, which sent a statue of Our Lady of Fatima with her message on a pilgrimage around the world. She was sent from country to country to arouse anti-Russian odium. Whole governments welcomed her. The Fatima cult is derived from the alleged appearance of the Virgin Mary to 3 sickly children in Fatima, Portugal, in 1917. With the appearance of Bolshevik Russia and world communism, the cult soon was transformed into an ideological crusade. It was used extensively in the anti-Russian ideological war carried out by Pius XII, Cardinal Spellman, and John Foster Dulles. The new Catholic Secretary of the United States Navy, Francis Matthews, strangely enough, soon afterwards began unusually active contacts with other prominent American Catholics. Pause, and as a quick reminder and aside, whenever someone is named, whenever a male has the name Francis, you always think that the parents had in mind honoring the co-founder of the Jesuits, Francis Xavier. Back to the citation. Among these, Father Walsh, Jesuit vice president of Georgetown University, Cardinal Spellman, the head of the American Legion, the leaders of the Catholic War veterans, and with Senator McCarthy, the arch-criminal senator, who upon the advice of a Catholic priest was just beginning his infamous campaign, which was to half paralyze the U.S. for some years to come. Let's pause again. That priest was Edmund Walsh, the Jesuit, who encouraged drunkard and incompetent Senator Joseph McCarthy, Irish Roman Catholic, to give cover for how the United States government was inundated and controlled by communist agents and plants with his buffoonery. After he was discredited, they had free rein in a Machiavellian and Luciferian art of war chess move. Back to the citation, Jesuit Father Walsh, the foremost Catholic authority in the U.S. and a former Vatican agent in Russia in 1925, told the American people that President Truman would be morally justified to take defensive measures proportionate to the danger, which of course meant the use of the atom bomb. When the U.S. went ahead with the manufacture of the hydrogen bomb, even the chairman of the Atomic Commission, Senator Brian McMahon, shrank in horror at the prospect of the sure massacre of 50 million people with such a monstrous weapon. The United States Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was the center of powerful anti-communist groups and anti-Russian lobbies, whose chief objective was in total harmony with that of the Vatican. These groups were disproportionately influenced by the Catholic elements and, with few notable exceptions, were supported by the Catholic Church in the United States. When, therefore, the Vietnam problem came increasingly to the fore, both the Vatican and the U.S. focused their joint activities toward that country. The chief formulators of the strategy were Secretary of State John Foster Dulles in the diplomatic field and Cardinal Spellman in the ecclesiastical. The importance of the latter was paramount, since Cardinal Spellman was the linchpin between Washington and the Vatican. This was so because Spellman had the ear not only of the powerful politicians and military men in the United States, but equally that of the Pope, a personal friend of his. And as a quick aside, the Vatican could appear to be devoutly anti-communist because its goal was to inflame and keep going the blood-letting, money-making machine of the Cold War. Back to the text. Subheading: Commiserating Catholic Communists in Castro's Cuba. How could America suffer nearly 2 decades of bloodletting, stalemate, and war profiteering at the hands of tiny Vietnam? Because the Jesuit Father General wanted it that way. How could Fidel Castro, still alive at this writing in 2015, survive the anti-communist wrath of the Central Intelligence Agency, who had slaughtered a sitting president in broad daylight? This is the same organization that had weaponized cancer and heart attack guns at their disposal since the early 60s. Because Castro was created by the Society of Jesus, and they run the CIA. Next, I cite from Fidel Castro, Perfil de un Jesuita Clandestino. Of course, this is in English. History confirms that Fidel Castro is an undercover Jesuit. The fidelity of this man is to serve the will of the General of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, based in the Vatican. Fidel Castro attended 3 Jesuit institutions, to include the Colegio La Salle and Colegio Dolores. He attended a Jesuit university in preparatory studies, what we might call a program of general studies at Bethlehem College. General studies because after enrollment there, he went to law school. After graduating from law school, he joined the Orthodox Christian Democrat Party, which is the Roman Catholic Party. Castro was obviously working full for Jesuits when he joined the Christian Democratic Party as a young lawyer. By the time of the Cuban Revolution in 1958 through to 59, the Jesuits in Latin America were Marxist-Leninist ideology. In 1963, the Jesuits became fanatical far-left communists, led by Pedro Urrupe, a Marxist and a great supporter of Fidel Castro. Father Malachi Martin documented in his book, The Jesuits and the Betrayal of the Roman Catholic Church, how Jesuits proceeded to foment communist revolutions throughout Latin America and Africa with the help of Castro. And by the way, even this outstanding, excellent article, gets it wrong. The Jesuits and the Catholic Church created communism. They didn't jump on board. Back to the text. Once Castro was thoroughly trained, his Spanish Jesuit handler, Armando Lorente, was exiled, in quotes,
unquotes, and quotes,
from Cuba, although this was for show, as Castro never truly fell out of favor with Rome. Lorente, who died in 2007 at the age of 91, would tell Spanish media that he waited in exile for Fidel to repent. As further theater, Pope John XXIII excommunicated Castro in 1962, but the official announcement was made by Dino Staffa, the secretary of the Congregation for Seminaries. Staffa was not the official representative of the Vatican authority from one sovereign state to another. The show began to wane by 1998 when Pope John Paul II visited the tiny nation. After Castro retired and left Cuba to the care of his brother Raul, the mask came off entirely. Benedict XVI openly met with the communist dictator and slammed the United States embargo. Subheading: The Jesuits and 9/11. On September 11, 2001, two planes made architectural engineering history by causing three massive buildings to pancake into their own footprint: World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7. That morning, Vice President Dick Cheney, former chairman and CEO of Halliburton, gave orders that at least one underling felt obliged to question. According to the congressional testimony of Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta, who was in the room at the time, Mineta assumed these were orders to stand down from shooting the jetliner that supposedly hit the Pentagon.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, do the orders still stand? And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Well, at the time I didn't know what all that meant.
Well, as an aside, Secretary Mineta still doesn't know what it meant. Because clearly, if it was meant to be the go-ahead to shoot down the airliner, it would have happened. What egregious spin. What it certainly looks like to me was this was a cog, a traitorous pawn, who had some level of insight into the unbelievable treason of 9/11 and would dare to question his ghoulish master. Sex trafficking survivor Kathy O'Brien made the claim that Dick Cheney was an arch child rapist and a fiend who took pleasure in hunting children in best Hunger Games fashion. And by the way, there are questions as to whether or not Suzanne Collins of Newtown, Connecticut, even wrote those novels. What is much more likely, as these monsters have made millions fictionalizing their unbelievable crimes. But we're on to them, and if you want more, you're going to have to tune in next time. This is Resistance Rising, and I'm your host, Johnny Cirucci.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.